Chapter 1. The War Begins. The night was cold. The sky over Kyiv was clear, filled with stars. The city was quiet, for now. People slept in their beds. Some checked their phones before closing their eyes. Others kissed their children good night. Then, at 4:30 a.m., everything changed. A loud explosion shook the ground. Then another, and another. The sky lit up with fire. Boom! The sound of missiles echoed across the city. Windows shattered. Alarms screamed. People woke up in fear. In the streets, cars rushed in different directions. Families ran to basements. Some still wore their pajamas. Mothers carried their babies. Fathers grabbed suitcases. But where could they go? Nowhere was safe. President Volodymyr Zelensky stood in his office. He had not slept. His phone was ringing. Ministers, generals, foreign leaders, everyone wanted answers. His hands gripped the desk. His heart pounded. Russia is attacking, a military advisor said. They are moving fast. Zelensky nodded. He already knew. The sound of war was outside his window. A video appeared on television. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, spoke with a cold, calm voice. His message was clear. This is a special military operation. Ukraine belongs to Russia. The world watched in shock. Some refused to believe it. Others had seen it coming. The West had warned Putin for months. Do not invade, they had said. There will be consequences. But Putin had not listened. The European Union held an emergency meeting. Leaders sat in a large room in Brussels, their faces serious. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, rubbed his forehead. French President Emmanuel Macron whispered to an aide. The Polish Prime Minister slammed his fist on the table. "We must act," he said. "We must stop Russia." But how? No one wanted war with a nuclear power. Sanctions. That was the answer. "We will freeze Russian bank accounts," one leader said. "We will cut them off from international trade," another added. "We will stop buying Russian gas," said a third. It sounded strong. It sounded serious. But was it enough? In Moscow, Putin did not seem worried. He sat in a large office, watching reports from his generals. His army was moving into Ukraine from the north, east, and south. Tanks rolled across the border. Russian soldiers marched forward. Kyiv, the capital, was the prize. If Russia could take Kyiv, the war would be over quickly. But Ukraine would not surrender. Ordinary people took up arms. Young men and women stood in long lines, waiting to get rifles. Grandmothers made homemade bombs. Fathers kissed their children and went to fight. For Ukraine, they said. For our future. And Zelensky? He stayed. He did not run. A video appeared on social media. Zelensky stood in the streets of Kyiv. The city behind him was dark, but his eyes were bright. "I am here. We will not give up." The world heard him. In Washington, D.C., U.S. President Joe Biden watched carefully. NATO leaders held secret talks. The question was dangerous. Should they send weapons to Ukraine? If they helped, the war might grow bigger. If they did nothing, Ukraine might fall. Days passed, then weeks. Kiev still stood. Ukraine fought back harder than anyone expected. Russian tanks burned on the roads. Planes fell from the sky. But the war was just beginning. And Europe would never be the same again. In Chapter 2, The Energy War. The wind was cold. The streets of Berlin were empty, silent. People stayed inside, wrapped in blankets, watching the news. The screens showed maps, pipelines, and red warning signs. A crisis was coming. For years, Russian gas flowed into Europe like a river. Warm homes, busy factories, shining city lights. Everything depended on it. Then, one day, it stopped. Moscow turned the taps off. No more gas. No more warmth. In Brussels, European leaders sat in a large room, the air heavy with tension. The French president leaned forward. "We must act fast," he said. The German chancellor nodded. "But how? Winter is coming. Our gas reserves are low." The Polish prime minister shook his head. "We told you," he said. "Russia uses energy as a weapon. Now look." It was true. Europe had depended on Russia for too long. Half of its gas came from Russian pipelines. Every winter, Moscow had the power to turn off the heat. But this time, it wasn't just a threat. It was real. In Moscow, Putin sat in a grand room with golden curtains. His advisors stood around him. They spoke in low voices. "The Europeans are weak," one man said. "They will beg for gas." Putin smiled. "Let them suffer," he said. In Berlin, the suffering had already begun. At night, the streets were dark. Store windows showed empty shelves. Factories cut working hours to save energy. People lined up outside gas stations, hoping to buy extra fuel. In a small apartment, an old woman sat alone. She wore 2 sweaters, a scarf, and gloves. She held a cup of tea, but it was already cold. The radiator in the corner made no sound. No heat, no warmth. She shivered. Across the city, another man sat in his kitchen. His gas bill lay open on the table. The numbers were high, too high. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from fear. How would he pay? And Berlin was not alone. In Paris, in Madrid, in Rome, the crisis spread. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the war continued. Russian missiles hit power plants. Cities went dark. But Ukrainians did not give up. They fought. They adapted. The question was, could Europe do the same? Governments rushed to find new energy sources. Ships from the United States carried liquefied natural gas across the ocean. Norway increased gas production. France restarted old nuclear power plants. But change was slow. And winter was not waiting. In the Netherlands, a group of farmers sat together in a barn. They burned wood to stay warm. One man sighed. "We never thought it would come to this." A woman nodded. Europe was too dependent on Russia. We should have seen it coming. By December, the first snow had fallen. The crisis was at its peak. Some countries reduced street lighting to save electricity. People took shorter showers. Some even cooked less. The news called it the Great Energy War. But there was one question everyone wanted to know. Who would break first? Europe or Russia? Putin believed he could wait. He thought Europe would fall apart. He thought people would protest, demanding their governments restore ties with Moscow. But Europe did not break. Germany built gas terminals in record time. Wind and solar energy expanded. People helped each other, sharing blankets, food, and hope. In Ukraine, soldiers fought through the cold. They had no choice. If they lost, their country would be gone. By February, the worst was over. The winter had been hard, but Europe had survived. In Moscow, the situation was different. Russian companies lost billions. Factories shut down. There were protests in the streets, not in Berlin, not in Paris, but in Russia. The energy war was supposed to make Europe weak. Instead, it made them stronger. A woman in Berlin turned on her heater. Warm air filled the room. She smiled. Europe had won. But the war was far from over. Chapter 3: Sanctions and Economic Warfare. The air in Moscow was cold, but the city was alive. People walked quickly down the streets, their coats pulled tight, their faces tense. Some hurried to work. Others stood in line outside banks. They checked their phones again and again. Something was wrong. The news spread fast. The European Union had announced new sanctions, the strongest in history. Russian banks cut off, trade stopped, luxury goods banned, oil sales restricted. The Russian stock market crashed. The ruble, once strong, fell like a stone. People rushed to withdraw money. Lines grew longer outside ATMs. Some machines ran out of cash. Panic spread. In a small shop, a woman picked up a chocolate bar. She looked at the price. It was higher than last week, much higher. She put it back. Everything was getting more expensive. At a gas station, a man filled his car. He watched the numbers climb. Too high, too fast. He shook his head. The sanctions were working. Or were they? In Brussels, European leaders sat around a long table. Maps and reports covered the desks. A screen showed red numbers. Russia's economy was shrinking. A voice filled the room. "This will hurt Moscow," one official said. "They will feel the pressure." But not everyone agreed. The Hungarian Prime Minister leaned forward. "And what about us?" he asked. "Our businesses? Our people?" The room was silent. The truth was clear. Sanctions hurt both sides. In Paris, factories slowed down. Without Russian oil, fuel prices rose. Shipping costs increased. Supermarkets struggled to keep prices low. People protested in the streets. The same happened in Rome, Madrid, and Berlin. The energy war had already made life hard. Now, economic war was making it worse. But in Moscow, Putin was not ready to give up. He met with his advisors in a dark room, away from cameras. The table was covered with documents, maps, and reports. He looked at his generals, then at his economists. "We have other friends," he said. "We do not need the West." The plan was simple. If Europe would not buy Russian oil, China and India would. Trains rolled east. Ships left Russian ports, carrying oil to Beijing and New Delhi. The West wanted to stop Russia's economy, but Russia found new markets. In Shanghai, Chinese officials signed agreements. More Russian gas, more Russian coal. India did the same. They bought oil at a discount. Moscow smiled. But there was another battle. The battle of technology. The sanctions blocked Russia from buying microchips, car parts, and airplane technology. Factories stopped. Cars sat unfinished. Russian airlines could not repair their planes. In a small workshop in St. Petersburg, a mechanic looked at an old Boeing plane. No new parts, no solution. His boss sighed. "We will have to find another way," he said. On Russian streets, McDonald's was gone. Starbucks, too. Western brands disappeared overnight. But soon, Russian versions took their place. New logos, new names, different but the same. The sanctions were changing Russia, but they were not breaking it. Months passed. The West stayed united, mostly. But not all countries agreed. Some wanted to restore trade. Some wanted cheaper gas. In Budapest, a Hungarian minister spoke carefully. "Maybe it's time to talk," he said. In Moscow, Putin smiled. The West was strong, but it was not unbreakable. The economic war continued. No one knew who would win. And winter was coming again. Chapter 4. Weapons and Diplomacy. The train moved fast through the Polish countryside. Inside, soldiers sat quietly, their faces serious. Some looked at their phones, reading news. Others stared out the window, watching the dark forests rush past. In the distance, the Ukrainian border was getting closer. In the last wagon, wooden crates were stacked high. Tanks, missiles, drones, weapons from Europe. Weapons that would soon be used on the battlefield. For years, the European Union had rules. No weapons to war zones, no direct involvement. But now, everything was different. Russia's invasion had changed the rules. In Brussels, inside a grand conference hall, European leaders sat around a long table. The German chancellor took a deep breath. "We have no choice," he said. The French president nodded. "If Ukraine falls, we are next." The discussion was over. Europe would send weapons. In Kiev, President Zelensky received the news. He stood in his office, his eyes tired but determined. Help was coming. His country had fought hard, but ammunition was running low. His army needed support. And now, at last, it was on the way. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin sat in a high-backed chair, watching reports on a large screen. Videos showed Western tanks rolling into Ukraine. His generals stood nearby, silent. "They are crossing the line," Putin said. His voice was calm, but his hands gripped the table. "They want war." In the Kremlin, a decision was made. Russia would strike harder. More missiles, more destruction, more fear. If Ukraine did not surrender, it would suffer. But Kyiv did not surrender. The first shipment of European weapons arrived in Ukraine. Soldiers unloaded crates in the cold night air. British anti-tank missiles, German howitzers, French artillery. Each weapon meant one thing: Ukraine could fight longer. On the battlefield, the difference was clear. Russian tanks exploded as Ukrainian soldiers fired from hidden positions. A convoy stopped. A city was defended. A village was saved. But war was not just about weapons. It was also about diplomacy. In Geneva, diplomats gathered in a quiet room. The Russians, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, the Americans. The air was heavy with tension. A Russian official leaned forward. "Surrender," he said. "End this war before it is too late." The Ukrainian diplomat shook his head. "Never." The talks continued for hours. Land, security, sanctions, prisoners, every word mattered. But in the end, there was no deal, no peace. As the meeting ended, a European negotiator sighed. "This war will not end soon," he whispered. In Kyiv, the sirens wailed again. Another Russian missile attack. Fire lit up the night sky, windows shattered, buildings collapsed. But Ukraine still stood. In a bunker below the city, Zelensky recorded a new message. He looked directly into the camera. His voice was firm. "Thank you, Europe," he said. "But we need more." The world listened. The war was far from over. And the weapons kept coming. Chapter 5. The Rise of European Defense. The rain fell steadily on a cold morning in Berlin. The streets were wet and empty. People walked slowly, their faces thoughtful. In a large hall in Berlin, military officials and government leaders gathered. They spoke in low voices, their words heavy with worry. The war in Ukraine had changed everything. For decades, Europe had relied on NATO for its defense. But now, something new was stirring. A young German officer, Hans, stood near a window. He looked out at the dark sky. He thought about his family and his country. He knew that the world was changing fast. His heart beat quickly as he listened to the discussions. Suddenly, a leader rose and announced a bold plan. "We must build a stronger defense," the leader said. "We need to stand on our own feet. This is the beginning of a new era for Europe." The room fell silent. Every word was clear and true. Hans felt hope and fear at the same time. He knew that building a new defense would not be easy, but he also knew that it was necessary. In Paris, another meeting took place. French leaders discussed the idea of military independence. They talked about history and the future. One leader said, "For too long, we have depended on others. It is time for Europe to be united in defense." His words echoed in the room. Many nodded. They believed that this new path could bring freedom and safety. In Warsaw, in Poland, leaders from the Baltic countries joined the conversation. They had seen the danger up close. Their small countries were always at risk. They demanded stronger defenses. "We must protect our lands," a Polish minister said firmly. "Our people need to feel safe." His voice was calm but strong, and it stirred the hearts of many. Meanwhile, Hans thought about his own role. He served in a unit that was now training with new tactics. His days began early and ended late. The soldiers practiced with new equipment and learned new plans. There was a sense of urgency in every exercise. Each drill was a step towards a better defense. They learned not just how to fight, but how to work together as one. In the training grounds, the air was filled with the sounds of boots on gravel and the commands of drill instructors. Hans's friend, Lucas, was by his side. Lucas had a serious look on his face, but his eyes held determination. "We are building a new Europe," he said softly. "We are more than just soldiers. We are the guardians of our future." The winter days were long and harsh. Snow covered the training fields. The cold wind made the exercises even more challenging. Yet the soldiers continued with courage. Every morning, they met the day with strength. Every night, they dreamed of a safe and free Europe. At the same time, leaders in Brussels worked on plans. They discussed new budgets for defense. They spoke about new military bases and advanced technology. The European Union began to act. The decisions were not made quickly. There were debates and disagreements. Yet, slowly, unity began to form. In quiet moments, one diplomat said, "We must remember that our goal is peace. A strong defense is not for war, but for peace." His words reminded everyone that the purpose of their efforts was to keep people safe and free. There was a feeling of hope in these words. It was a hope that each country could stand together without losing its identity. Back in Berlin, Hans listened to a radio broadcast. The news was full of reports from many European cities. The report said that Germany had announced a massive military buildup. France was pushing for a united European army. Poland and the Baltic states were calling for even stronger defenses. The report ended with a question that made Hans think deeply. Could this be the birth of a new European superpower? Hans did not know the answer. He only knew that the war had changed everything. The old ways of relying on NATO alone were gone. Now, Europe was beginning to build its own future. This future was uncertain and hard to predict, but it was a future that promised strength and unity. In a small cafe in Berlin, an old man sat by the window. He sipped his coffee slowly. His eyes followed the passing crowd. He remembered the old days when Europe was weak and divided. "Now," he whispered, "we are rising again." His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of history. The day ended with the sun setting behind gray clouds. The leaders, soldiers, and common people all shared a common feeling. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But they also knew that they must try. They must build a strong and united Europe. As the night fell, the lights in Berlin shone like beacons of hope. The soldiers went home to their families. The leaders returned to their offices, planning the next steps. And Hans, looking out at the quiet streets, felt a small spark of hope. In his heart, he believed that the rise of European defense was not just a military plan. It was the beginning of a new era of peace and security for all. The story of Europe's new defense was just starting. The voices of its people were growing louder. The dream of a united and strong continent was alive. And even in the darkest hours, there was light on the horizon, a light that promised a better tomorrow for everyone. Chapter 6. Putin versus the West. The night was quiet in Brussels. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement. Inside a dark office, a man sat in front of a glowing screen. His fingers moved fast, lines of code flashing before his eyes. He was not in Belgium. He was in Moscow. And with one final keystroke, he pressed enter. Thousands of kilometers away, government websites in Europe went black. Banking systems slowed. Traffic lights stopped working in some cities. Confusion spread. A cyber attack. Silent, invisible, powerful. By morning, the European press was in chaos. Headlines screamed warnings. Cyber war. Is Russia behind the attacks? Experts on television spoke in nervous voices. We have seen this before, one analyst said. This is not just a technical failure. This is a message. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin watched the news with cold eyes. His advisors stood around him. Some looked pleased. Others were waiting for orders. The West wants to weaken us, one general said. But we will weaken them first. Putin nodded slowly. We do not need tanks to win this war, he said. We need patience and pressure. In Berlin, inside a high-security meeting room, European leaders gathered. The cyber attacks had caused panic, but that was only part of the problem. On the table lay secret reports, pages filled with names, connections, and warnings. Some European politicians were not standing with the West. Some were helping Moscow. A French minister cleared his throat. We have proof, he said. Russian money is influencing politics here in Europe. Silence. The German chancellor rubbed his forehead. How bad is it? He asked. Bad, the minister said. Disinformation is spreading. False stories about Ukraine, lies about NATO, propaganda designed to divide us. Putin's strategy was working, not with bombs, not with missiles, but with words. In a small cafe in Budapest, a group of young men sat together. They scrolled through their phones. One of them shook his head. Look at this, he said, showing a video. A politician was speaking. Europe should not support Ukraine. The politician said, Russia is not our enemy. Maybe he's right, the young man said. Maybe we should stop helping them. His friend frowned. Are you sure that's true? Or is it just Russian propaganda? That was the question. What was real? What was false? The line between truth and lies was disappearing. Back in Brussels, intelligence agents worked day and night. Their job was to find out where the money flowed, who was loyal, who was not. One evening, a young analyst leaned over his desk, staring at a name on his screen. His heart pounded. He picked up the phone. I think I found something, he said. In a secret office, investigators looked at bank records, millions of euros, hidden transfers, Russian money moving through silent channels, reaching politicians, journalists, businessmen. A British official slammed his fist on the table. This is war, he said, not with guns, but with influence. Meanwhile, in Washington, U.S. intelligence officers watched everything closely. The White House knew what was happening. They had seen these tactics before. A top American general spoke to European leaders on a secure call. This is Russia's strategy, he said. They divide you. They make you doubt each other. And then they win. In the Kremlin, Putin sat alone in his office. Outside, the Moscow night was still. He knew the West was watching him. He knew they were trying to stop him, but he also knew something else. Europe was not as strong as it seemed. There were cracks, and cracks could grow. Putin's war was not just on the battlefield. It was in the shadows, too, and it was far from over. Chapter 7. A divided Europe? The rain fell lightly on the streets of Brussels. The air was cold, but inside the grand hall, the tension was hotter than ever. European leaders sat around a long table. Their faces were serious. Some whispered to their aides. Others tapped their fingers on the table. They had gathered to make a decision. But not everyone agreed. The war in Ukraine had changed everything. In the beginning, Europe stood together. They sent weapons. They cut ties with Moscow. They imposed the toughest sanctions in history. But now, things were different. Hungary's prime minister leaned forward. His voice was calm, but firm. Enough, he said. These sanctions hurt us more than they hurt Russia. Silence. A Polish minister shook his head. His hands were clenched into fists. You want to surrender? He asked. You want to let Putin win? The Hungarian leader sighed. No, but my people are suffering. Energy prices are too high. Our economy is breaking. He paused, looking around the room. How long can we continue like this? In the corner, the British representative crossed his arms. His voice was sharp. As long as it takes. France and Germany stayed quiet. They had their own problems. Businesses were closing. Protests were growing. People were tired of war, of rising prices, of uncertainty. The cracks in Europe's unity were growing. In a small cafe in Slovakia, an old man sat with his newspaper. He shook his head. "We need peace," he muttered. "This war is not ours." A young man at the next table looked up. "If Ukraine falls, what happens next?" he asked. "Do you think Putin will stop?" The old man sighed. "I just want things to go back to normal." But nothing was normal anymore. In Warsaw, people marched in the streets. They carried flags, shouting, "Stand with Ukraine." They remembered their own history. They knew what it meant to fight for freedom. In Budapest, it was different. Another protest, another crowd. But these people carried signs that said, "Stop the sanctions," and "Peace talks now." Europe was divided. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin watched the news. He saw the protests, the arguments, the disagreements. He smiled. "They are breaking," he said to his advisors. "Soon they will turn against each other." But was he right? In Kiev, President Zelensky knew what was happening. He spoke directly to the people of Europe. His face was tired, his voice strong. "We fight for our freedom," he said. "We fight for yours too." His words spread across the continent. Some listened. Some turned away. In Berlin, a mother stood in front of the supermarket shelves. The prices were too high. Her hands shook as she counted her money. "How much longer can we do this?" she whispered. In London, a soldier packed his bag. He was being sent to Poland, closer to the border. "We must be ready," his commander had said. "Europe is at a turning point." In Brussels, the meeting continued. The leaders argued. Some wanted to send more weapons. Some wanted to open peace talks. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the question was in the air. Was Europe still united? The answer was unclear. The night was long. The decisions were difficult. In the morning, the sun rose over a divided continent, and the war went on. Chapter 8. The NATO Factor. The sky over Helsinki was gray. A cold wind blew across the city. People walked quickly through the streets, wrapped in heavy coats. But inside the Finnish parliament, the air was warm. The room was full. Politicians sat in silence, waiting for the vote. The decision had already been made. Now it was time to make it official. A man stood up. His voice was steady. Finland will join NATO. The room erupted in applause. Some cheered, others wiped their eyes. For decades, Finland had remained neutral. Not anymore. Across the Baltic Sea, Sweden was making the same choice. Their leader stepped in front of the cameras. "We must protect our future," she said. "We stand with our allies." The message was clear. Finland and Sweden were no longer on the sidelines. They were now part of NATO. And Russia was watching. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin sat in his office. His advisors stood around him. A large map covered the table. Red lines marked Russia's borders. Now, those borders had NATO troops on the other side. Putin's face was calm. but his fingers tapped the table. "This is a serious mistake," he said. His voice was low, dangerous. A general stepped forward. "They are moving troops closer to us," he said. "We must respond." A second advisor spoke. "They did not listen to our warnings," he said. "Now, we must show strength." Putin nodded. "Let them be afraid," he said. "Let them feel the consequences." Days later, Russian warplanes flew close to Finnish airspace. A test, a warning. Finland sent its own jets to meet them. The skies were tense. One wrong move, and everything could change. In Washington, NATO leaders watched closely. The alliance had grown. It was stronger than ever. But was it ready for the next step? In Poland, new military bases were built. In Estonia, NATO troops arrived. In Lithuania, tanks rolled through the streets during military drills. Russia was surrounded. A NATO commander stood in front of a row of soldiers. "We are here to defend," he said, "not to start a war." But Moscow did not believe them. On Russian television, the news was different. The West was planning to attack. NATO was the real threat. People in Russian villages watched the reports. Some were afraid. Some were angry. In a small town near the Russian-Finnish border, an old man sat by his radio. He had lived through many wars. He had seen many leaders come and go. He shook his head. "Nothing good will come from this," he whispered. In a secret room in Brussels, European leaders met behind closed doors. A French official rubbed his forehead. "We are playing with fire," he said. A British general shook his head. "No," he said. "We are protecting our future." The room was silent for a moment. Then a German official spoke. "Will Russia attack?" No one answered. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the war continued. Missiles hit cities. Soldiers fought in the trenches. The people had no time to think about NATO, Finland, or Sweden. They were just trying to survive. But in Moscow, everything was connected. A Russian minister spoke on television. "NATO is pushing us into a corner," he said. "We will not stay silent." The world held its breath. Would Russia strike back? Would NATO go even further? Or was this the beginning of an uneasy peace? Nobody knew. And so the world watched and waited. Chapter 9, 2025. The war's turning point? The sun was rising over Kyiv. The city had changed. Some buildings stood tall, untouched by war. Others were broken, their windows shattered, their walls blackened by fire. Streets were filled with soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary people trying to live their lives. The war had lasted for 3 years, and still it was not over. In a dark bunker beneath the city, President Zelensky sat at a long table. His advisors were around him. Maps covered the walls. Reports were spread across the table. The room smelled of coffee and exhaustion. A general cleared his throat. "Our forces have made progress," he said. His voice was steady. "We have pushed them back in the east." There was a murmur of approval. It was true. Ukraine had fought harder than anyone expected. At the beginning, Russia had seemed unstoppable. Now, their army was weaker. Their losses were high. But Russia was not finished. In Moscow, Putin sat in his grand office, staring at a map. His fingers tapped the table. A cold silence filled the room. His generals stood waiting. No one spoke. They all knew the truth. The war was not going as planned. An advisor stepped forward. "We still control parts of Ukraine," he said carefully. "We still have options." Putin's eyes narrowed. "Options," he repeated. His voice was quiet, but dangerous. He looked at another general. "And the West?" The general sighed. "Europe has adjusted. They no longer need our gas." He hesitated. "Their economies are stable. They continue to send weapons to Ukraine." For the first time in decades, Russia was not in control. In Brussels, European leaders met again. The war had cost them billions, but they were stronger now. New energy sources, new industries, a stronger military. They had changed, just as Ukraine had changed. But the question remained. Could this war finally end? In Geneva, peace talks began. The room was filled with diplomats, journalists, and security officers. The air was heavy with tension. The Ukrainian representative sat on one side of the table. The Russian delegate sat on the other. Between them, a United Nations official cleared his throat. "Let's begin," he said. For hours they talked. Land, sanctions, prisoners, ceasefires. Every word was important. Every silence was louder than bombs. Then, suddenly, the Russian delegate stood up. "We will not agree to these terms," he said. "This is a waste of time." He turned and walked out. The peace talks were over. In Kyiv, Zelensky listened to the news. His hands tightened into fists. He had hoped, even after everything, that there was a chance for peace. But now, there was only one choice left. "We keep fighting," he said. Across Ukraine, soldiers prepared for battle. Weapons arrived from the West. New strategies were planned. The people did not want war, but they also refused to surrender. In Moscow, Putin made his own decision. If diplomacy failed, then war would continue. He ordered more troops to the front, more missiles, more attacks. The world watched, waiting for a sign. Would Russia push forward? Would Ukraine strike back harder? Or was something even worse about to happen? In Washington, intelligence agencies studied satellite images. Something was changing in Russia. New troop movements, unusual activity at military bases. A Pentagon official frowned at the screen. "What are they planning?" he muttered. In Poland, NATO forces were on high alert. In Berlin, emergency meetings were called DOT. The war was reaching its most dangerous point. Back in Kyiv, the sirens wailed. Another missile attack, another sleepless night. People ran to underground shelters. A mother held her child close, whispering words of comfort. A young man gripped his rifle, ready to defend his home. The question echoed in everyone's mind. Would this war ever end? And no one knew the answer.